Welcome back to the Exchange Server 2016 infrastructure course. Now we're going to talk about deployment, Exchange deployment. So in this module, we're going to talk about the new 2016 architecture. Yes, we changed it again. But, don't be too worried. It wasn't a major change. I think everybody knew that this architecture change was coming. So we're going to talk about the new Exchange Server 2016 architecture. And then we're going to talk about the installation of the Exchange server. So there's two ways that you can do that. You can do it using the wizard or unattended. So some companies are going to use one way, another company is going to use the other way. So let's go into the Exchange server architecture. The Exchange server architecture has been updated to include new role consolidation. And I'm not going to give it away just yet. I want people to really understand why we changed the Exchange Server 20 architecture. But I also want to remind you that there's an edX course. In the first module, we provided a link to edX. And in that course, you can find out more about this architecture and understand the details around why they did that. But let's go into some of this architecture. Joe.
Wow. So I remember Exchange 2010, I think, was the last time we had 5 different server roles, which we had the Mailbox server role, of course, client access server role, hub transport role, unified messaging, and then edge transport. After 2010, 2013, we consolidated the transport role in with the Mailbox server role, as we did with the unified messaging as well. We still left the client access services role available if you wanted to run it like in the days of 2003, where you had a front end, back end sort of configuration. I think we called that a cafe server when you ran just the client access roles on that. But we did also begin integrating the client access services into the Mailbox server role in 2013. And now we arrive at 2016, and 2016 now manages all the roles except for edge transport. So Mailbox takes care of your high availability with database availability groups, still handles the storage of mail. Client access services that provides your authentication, redirection, proxy of servers, and support for HTTP, POP and IMAP, and even SMTP protocols, because the front-end transport layer is in the client access services layer. So speaking of transport, we have now 3 transport services. Your front-end transport service, again, which is part of that client's access services layer. The transport service, which handles internal SMTP mail flow, categorization and content inspection. And then the Mailbox transport service, which is actually 2 different services, the submission service and the delivery service. And that's used to send messages to other servers, and also works with the Mailbox database to retrieve or submit data to that database. And then, of course, unified messaging.
Okay, so in summary, there's really just one role now.
Other than edge transport, there's just one role.
You have the edge transport role, which is in the perimeter network, and then you have this one role that you deploy to host everything.
Absolutely.
So that's really simple. It's not that tricky, and it just makes sense that now that everything is on one role, you don't have to think about, I'm going to split this and put this in this site and that in another site and so on. You now just deploy Exchange Server, and you configure that Exchange Server to do what it's supposed to do, host mailboxes, or maybe the server is going to be part of a public folder server or something like that. But it's one server that you deploy in your environment, and that one server is then the building block of your bigger Exchange organization. Okay, no, that really makes sense, and I saw that coming.
I think a lot of people did.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the features that was de-emphasized in 2016. So with discontinued and de-emphasized features, it's not really about what the features are doing. It's about, de-emphasizing, so sometimes it's still there, but it's no longer important, or we do it in a different way. To summarize some of them, like the unified messaging server role, it's still there, all the functionality is still there, but it's no longer a dedicated role that you can deploy in your environment. It's just part of the Mailbox server. The same with the hub transport server. It's not like Exchange doesn't send mail anymore. It's still there, but it's part of the Mailbox server. The Exchange Management Console and the control panel is one of those things that changed names. It's now the Exchange Admin Center. So it's not like it's de-emphasized. It's just the name has changed, and it works differently. We do no longer support RPC connections directly to the Mailbox server. You have to use Outlook Anywhere to connect to your Exchange servers if you want to use Outlook clients to connect to your Exchange server. So that's another thing that is discontinued. So no longer can you connect directly to the Mailbox servers using RPC. It needs to have RPC over HTTP or Outlook Anywhere or the MAPI HTTP connectivity. Spell checking in OA, or now as it's called Outlook on the web. Previously we had spell checking functionality, but the browsers has sort of come to the party, and now spell checking is part of a web browser experience. Everybody expects a web browser, when you type in your comment on Facebook, to check your spelling, and some people ignore that. But that functionality is now built into a browser, so it's no longer needed to have a spell checker inside of OA. Then there's some custom flags and filtered views and so on that's no longer in OA as well. Not a big deal. Most of these features are driven by usage. If we see people don't use those features, we do a lot of studies around that, then we stop supporting those features because, why invest any more time in keeping those features up to date? Anti-spam agent management is no longer in the Exchange Management Console, so you have to do that with the Edge server, or you have to add those components. And then manage folders is also no longer supported because we have so many other features that's available in Exchange that sort of does the same functionality. There's other features as well that we want to highlight as well. The client access server role is no longer supported as a dedicated role. That's now part of the Mailbox again. MAPI access, CDO access, this relates to the RPC access. That's no longer available. So if you have an application that uses MAPI or CDO, that's your collaboration data objects libraries, to interact with Exchange servers, then you need to make sure that those applications uses Outlook Anywhere to connect to the Mailbox servers. Then in terms of de-emphasized features from Exchange Server 2016, so this really means those features are still there, but we would rather you do it in a different way. And the first one is RPC over HTTP or Outlook Anywhere. We now have the MAPI over HTTP protocol, which is a much faster, better way of connecting to your Exchange servers. And so the RPC over HTTP, there's just so many layers in there, and it's not really that effective. So we want you to use the MAPI over HTTP connectivity. Then another feature that we de-emphasized was database availability groups, or DAGs, support for failover clusters with administrative access points. So this is where your DAG name becomes like a server that you can connect to do administrative access. You can now have IP list DAG, and it doesn't need all of that extra overhead to manage that Exchange server, and that reduces complexity. And we all know that complexity actually causes support issues. So whenever you can remove complexity in your environment, you really actually make your Exchange server much more available. And then finally, the last feature that we de-emphasize is third-party replication APIs. There's still support for that in Exchange, but the database availability group replication that's built into Exchange really works well, and we don't think that you need that extra complexity of a hardware solution that does replication in the background, and you hope that it works the day that you really need it. So you can just rely on the built-in functionality of Exchange. So again, we want to sort of emphasize there that people use the built-in replication and not third-party application APIs. But it's still there if you need it for your organization. So those are the discontinued and de-emphasized features. Let's talk about the deployment options of Exchange Server 2016. When you deploy Exchange Server, there's really two versions of Exchange, and this has been like ever since, you know, the Exchange 4, Exchange 5.0. You had these two editions of Exchange, Standard Edition.
For small company organizations.
Small organizations that want to just mount 5 databases. And those 5 databases can be part of a DAG. So you don't need the enterprise version, but you can still make it a database availability group. So even if you're a really small organization and you want to have high availability, then it doesn't mean that you can't run it because you don't have enterprise edition, so you can do it with standard edition.
And then the enterprise edition, which allows you to mount up to 100 mailbox databases. And I think between the standard and enterprise versions, that's really the primary difference between the two, is it not?
Yeah, so that's basically it. On the client side, we also have, so this is the license that you need to connect to the Exchange servers. So you have 2 types of licenses. You have a standard CAL and an enterprise CAL. And the standard CAL is just default mailbox access, and the enterprise CAL is that gives you the enterprise features like the legal holds and the archive mailbox and unified messaging and so on. Those are
all the good stuff.
All the good stuff, the stuff that you really want as well.
Yeah.
In terms of deployment scenarios, some organizations will do one server, run everything on that one server. And
if they do that, isn't that recommended that you deploy that in a virtual machine then?
Yeah, you can run it in a virtual machine. Maybe you have some sort of private cloud solution that you host all your machines on, and then you have a single server deployment, and your virtual machine, maybe it's Hyper-V cluster or something like that, and the high availability will be part of that Hyper-V system. If the VM fails, that single server fails on one cluster node, then it will just fail over to another cluster node and continue running. So that's a good scenario there. Or you can have multiple servers. And so that, I guess, is what many companies will do, is they will have many servers, and you have to determine where you're going to put those servers.
Really important in when you start talking about site resiliency, which I think we discussed that quite a bit in the edX course for mailbox databases.
Yeah. So multiple servers is you have to decide, maybe I need servers closer to my users, maybe I need them at certain locations for applications to support those applications, or maybe I need to have those servers in my data centers, that is my central locations or something like that. And then our last deployment option is hybrid. And with hybrid, that's when you connect your Exchange on-prem environment with Office 365, and you coexist the two. And you may decide that I'm going to move some of my mailboxes to the cloud, and some of them are going to be on-premise, or I'm going to use some of the functionality in the cloud, like the anti-spam functionality, or I'm going to use the archive mailboxes that's in the cloud. So there's lots of options there with hybrid deployments as well for Exchange.
Why don't we talk a little bit more about on-premise versus on-premises, I should say, versus Exchange Online. I think we have the next slide that comes up.
So with the Exchange on-premise versus online, we basically, the word on-premises means that you have your Exchange server on your own servers in your own data center. So it's you own everything. You perform the maintenance of those servers, and you set up, you do upgrades, and you
deal with all the headaches that go along with that as well.
Yes, you have people on staff that need to know Exchange, and they need to know how to patch servers and how to upgrade firmware of the hardware and so on. So and maybe you have teams and teams of people that needs to do those things, because you have all these other servers as well that does those things. But with Exchange Online, on the other hand, it's software as a service that's in the cloud. So all your mailboxes is in the cloud. You don't have any of the servers yourself. The servers is in the Microsoft data centers in various locations around the world. You can decide, depending on where you create your tenant, this will be in Europe or in the Far East or in North America. So there's various places where you can create your Exchange tenant. And you don't need to worry about updates anymore, because Microsoft will do all of those things. Microsoft will introduce the new features. You will log in, and tomorrow you'll log in again and you'll see, hey, here's a new feature that can do blah. and you would think, why did I ever run, how could I ever have, run my life without that? Yeah, so that's amazing about running Exchange in the cloud.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So here's some reasons why people would actually consider using Exchange Online. Again, there's cost reasons. When you run Exchange Online, you go into a subscription model. So there's no capital that you pay, and you buy servers, and you have to buy a data center and so on. It's very expensive to set those things up. And sometimes when you set up a data center, you have to write off your data center architecture or that building over 30 years. So it's like a 30-year commitment to
total cost of ownership.
Yes. So it can
be way down with Exchange Online.
Yeah. And then we also have administration effort. You don't have to patch servers. You don't have to swap hard drives if a hard drive fails and so on. So that's a lot of admin that just goes away. And you also have disaster recovery. Exchange Online takes care of your disaster recovery. You don't have to make sure that if a database fails, that you have a backup to restore that. All of that is taken care of by the Exchange Online service. There's flexibility as well, and this could be a flexibility that you want. So maybe if you need to run an application on your server that does something to email messages because you're in an industry that needs to investigate emails and so on, and there's certainly some of that functionality in Exchange Online, but you don't have all that flexibility on Exchange Online, because you can't come to Microsoft with an application and say, can you install this on all the Exchange servers that is hosting my mailboxes? So you have a little bit less flexibility when you run Exchange Online, because you can't do with those servers that you want to do. It is shared infrastructure, so you don't have all of that flexibility. And then finally, there's an environmental impact as well when it comes to Exchange Online, because those data centers are run very efficient in terms of its energy usage. It makes sure that it uses a lot of green energy. It uses the best cooling technology that doesn't have a lot of CO2 emissions and things like that. So it's really effective in terms of the environmental impact, to really cut it as low as you can to make sure. And they talk about the PE ratio of running these data centers, and Microsoft really tries to make sure that the data centers are running really effective in terms of the environment impact. So again, you have that benefit that when you use Exchange Online, that it will make it really environmentally friendly for running email. Who knew?
Who knew?
So I think that wraps up some of our deployment options. Let's now talk about installation of Exchange Server. So to recap, our AD is prepared. We've done the schema update. We've done the necessary permissions. Now we can set up Exchange. So the one way that you can set up Exchange is using a setup wizard.
In which case we probably haven't prepared the schema or the forest, because usually you rely on the setup wizard to do all that for you.
Yes. So Microsoft is famous for the setup wizard. Ever since Microsoft existed and they started doing GUI stuff, they introduced the setup wizard, and it takes you through a step-by-step process of setting up Exchange, and you answer very easy questions, and it gives you, a
Step-by-step walks you through it.
Installed Exchange server. Another option is to use unintended mode. With unintended mode, this is where you use a command line interface and you specify all the parameters as part of that command line to create a Exchange server, to install your first Exchange server. And this really works well when you have to do a lot of Exchange servers and you don't want to just click on next, next, next and waste time. You just run one command and you set up Exchange. And then once you've installed all of your Exchange servers, you have to do some post-installation tasks as well, and you have to make sure that your Exchange server is configured correctly and it can receive mail and it can send mail, and you created your mailboxes and so on. Or if it's an upgrade scenario, you move mailboxes to that server or you create more databases. So there's many post-installation tasks as well that you have to do after you've installed Exchange. So the setup wizard, let's talk about the setup wizard. What does the setup wizard do when we run this? And it's basically these 8 simple steps that it takes you through when you run the setup wizard. Very simple. It first checks, are you running the latest version of Exchange? It would be sad if you install Exchange and you a couple of updates behind. So if your Exchange server does have internet connectivity, that first step, it will tell you, oh, I'm just going to check if you're running the latest Exchange setup. And if you don't, it will tell you that you can download it and then install it. So that's the first step. The next step is it will ask you that very important license agreement to make sure that you agree with the license terms of running Microsoft software. And you have to read all of that. Make sure that you send it to your lawyers and they accept that as well. And then you have to check that box to say, I accept this license agreements with a good heart. And then you click on next.
And an open mind.
Then there's some recommended settings that it asks you about. And this is really to tell you it is going to gather some information about the setup process, and at the end of the setup process it will send that information to Microsoft, and it's really anonymous information. It doesn't know anything about your organization, but they use that information as data to help them make the setup better. So they see, for example, oh, at this step it took too long and why did it time out and it did something else. So but you can decide, I don't want to send that information to Microsoft, and so that's the recommended settings. After that, you choose what server role that you're going to install. Mailbox server role, Edge server role.
It's either Mailbox server role or Edge server role.
Yeah, so there's 3 tick boxes. The one is
management tools.
Management tools. So you can say, I don't want to install Exchange server at this point. I just want to install the management tools. But if you choose any of the other 2, it's going to automatically choose the management tools for you.
Yes. Because
you can't opt out of not, I want to install Exchange server, but I don't want the management tools. That would be crazy. So then after you've chosen your servers, you're going to say, I want to install it in this directory. You say the location. If you click next and it sees that you don't have Exchange organization created already, it's going to ask you what your Exchange organization must be. You should give it a name that makes sense, like the organizational name. But people would rarely see this name. So it's not like it needs to be a name that lasts till the end of time. I know a lot of companies change names and so on, and then they're worried, oh, but I made my Exchange organization name this name, but my organization was now renamed to something else, and so the name doesn't jive. Yeah, so don't worry about that, because if the name is not the same, people wouldn't see that. Sometimes you see it in when a message cannot be delivered. and you get that
NDR
message back, you will see a reference to the org name and so on. So people might say, hey, no, this is still the old name. You know, nobody would cry at that point. They would cry because the message wasn't delivered.
Exactly.
So you know, but also don't make it something silly, this organization name. If you make it something silly, then people will see that as well. And, you know, then they might just laugh at you for the next 100 years. And then finally, you decide whether or not you want malware settings, malware protection enabled on the server. So you would disable this if you're going to install a different antivirus application.
A third party.
Yes, so if you are a company that runs another antivirus solution and you don't want to use the built-in antivirus capabilities of Exchange, then you can say, don't install the Exchange stuff, I want to use mine. And then before the Exchange setup starts, it does a readiness check. And this is very similar to the best practice analyzer that was introduced in Exchange 2003 and was really kept up to date, where it scans some information about your environment and it tells you that, you know, you're not running the latest version of this driver, or
you forgot to install that this prerequisite or that prerequisite.
Yes, so it does a couple of readiness checks to make sure that your Exchange server is ready to install Exchange before it actually goes and installs Exchange. So if we look at some of the post-installation tasks that you need to do after you've installed Exchange, first thing that you need to do is that everything is up and running. You know, all the services are running. It's supposed to do what it needs to do. If a service doesn't start, then you may want to investigate that. Maybe something went wrong with the installation, or there's a problem with your Active Directory or so on. So you need to make sure that your Exchange server by itself is running. It's always a good idea to secure your Exchange servers.
In many different ways.
Many different.
Physically, you want to make sure that not everybody in the company has access to that server. You want to restrict communication, perhaps using a firewall to block certain ports or IP addresses from being able to communicate with that server. Investigating, you want to reduce the attack surface. You don't want to be running just any old social media application on your Exchange server, especially if it's an edge transport server, which is in your perimeter network, which has potentially more exposure to the internet. The only thing you probably want to install on that server is the edge transport role. And then restricting permissions and access to that server through ACLs.
Yeah. So, you know, sometimes if you have a problem in your environment, it's really tempting to give people more access to resolve the issue. And sometimes, you know, you want to see what happens if the problem that I have is caused by permissions. And so you would give the Exchange servers and people more access so that they can resolve an issue. And you don't take those permissions away again, and therefore you've sort of opened yourself up to exposure and people doing things that they're not supposed to do. So just be careful. So you always want to restrict access to the people that really needs that access. And then finally, you have to install any additional software that you may want to deploy in your organization, like antivirus software or anti-spam software. If you're going to do backups in your environment, and it's funny that we are saying if you want to do backups, because there is really an if in Exchange. But if you still do backups, then you want to install your backup agent or software on your Exchange server. And the monitoring software, like the now I'm really dating myself. Your System Center Operations Manager.
SCCM.
Yeah. So if you want to install that agents on your environment, then you do that on that after you've installed Exchange as well. So that wraps up our module on Exchange deployment, and stay tuned for Exchange management.